Poor Waitress saves dying billionaire. His reaction changes her life forever. What if a single moment of pure kindness could alter two lives irrevocably? What if a seemingly insignificant gesture, done with no expectation of reward, could unlock a future neither person had ever deemed possible? The fluorescent lights hummed noisily in Murphy's diner, casting their harsh, unwavering glow across the cracked vinyl booths and the worn linoleum floor. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday, and the diner was practically deserted, save for the handful of late-night regulars sipping their coffees and the occasional trucker stopping in for a slice of pie. Behind the counter, Elena Vasquez stood wiping down surfaces that had already been cleaned countless times. At 42 years old, she had been working double shifts at Murphy's for the past 3 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform bore the faint, stubborn stains that no amount of bleach could completely remove. She moved with the efficiency born of necessity, making every motion count and every step purposeful. The arthritis in her hands was acting up again, aggravated by the cold October rain that had been falling steadily all evening, but she persevered. She had to. The rent was due next week, and her teenage daughter Maria desperately needed new school shoes. Eleanor had long since given up on dreaming of anything beyond simply getting through each day, each shift, each minor crisis that seemed to define her existence. But sometimes, late at night in the quiet diner, she would find herself humming the old songs her grandmother used to sing, and for just a fleeting moment she would remember the feeling of hope. Where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know what small acts of kindness have touched your heart recently. The door chimed as someone entered, bringing with them a gust of cold air and the sound of rain drumming against the concrete outside. Eleanor glanced up from the coffee pot she had been cleaning and saw a man in an expensive overcoat stumble through the entrance. Even in the diner's dim light, she could tell that something was amiss. He moved like someone struggling against his own body, each step deliberate and careful. His silver hair was disheveled, and his normally pristine appearance was somehow diminished, although his clothes still spoke of a level of wealth that most people in that neighborhood could only dream of. "Just coffee," he said quietly, sliding into a corner booth with his back to the wall. His voice had the slight rasp of someone who wasn't feeling well, and when Eleanor brought him the steaming mug, she noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for it. She'd been serving customers long enough to recognize when someone was struggling with more than just a bad day. "You okay, sir?" she asked gently, using the same tone she used when Maria was coming down with something. "You look like you might need more than just coffee." He glanced up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized all too well, the look of someone who was accustomed to handling everything on their own. "I'm fine," he said, but the words came out weaker than he probably intended. "Just tired." Elena nodded, understanding that sometimes people needed to maintain their dignity even when they were falling apart. She'd felt that way herself more times than she could count. But something about this man tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, as if he were carrying invisible weights. Or maybe it was the way he carefully counted out the exact change from his wallet, despite clearly having plenty of money. Whatever it was, her instincts told her to pay attention. Over the next hour, she watched him from the corner of her eye as she went about her closing duties. He barely touched his coffee, and twice she saw him grip the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself. When he stood to leave, he swayed slightly, catching himself against the booth. "Sir," Elena called softly, "are you sure you're all right? You don't look well." For a moment, it seemed like he might brush off her concern again. Then something shifted in his expression, a crack in whatever armor he'd been wearing. I haven't been feeling myself lately," he admitted, "but I'll be fine. Thank you for asking." As he walked toward the door, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. Sometimes the right choice isn't the safe choice, and sometimes caring for a stranger requires stepping beyond the boundaries of what's expected. She grabbed her coat from behind the counter and followed him outside into the rain. The parking lot was slick with rain, and Elena found him leaning heavily against a black sedan that probably cost more than she made in 2 years. But right now, he looked like any other person who needed help. Money and status meaningless in the face of human frailty. "Hey," she called softly, approaching him with the same careful respect she'd show a frightened animal. "I'm Eleanor. I know we just met, but something tells me you shouldn't be driving right now." He turned toward her, rain dripping from his silver hair, and she could see he was fighting some internal battle between pride and the growing realization that he might actually need help. "I'm Richard," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Richard Walsh. And you're probably right, but I don't really have anyone to call." The admission hung between them in the damp air. Eleanor had heard loneliness in many forms over her years working nights at the diner, but something about the way he said those words struck her deeply. This wasn't just about being sick. This was about being completely, utterly alone when you needed someone most. "Well, you do now," she said simply. "Look, I get off shift in 20 minutes. My car isn't much to look at, but it runs, and I can give you a ride wherever you need to go. Or there's a hospital about 10 minutes from here if you think you need to be checked out." Richard studied her face in the glow of the diner's neon sign, as if trying to understand why this stranger would care. "You don't even know me," he said. "I could be anyone." Eleanor smiled, the kind of warm smile that had comforted countless customers over the years and eased countless worries of her own daughter. "You're someone who needs help right now. That's all I need to know." What happened next would later seem like the pivot point around which both their lives turned. Richard, a man who hadn't accepted help from anyone in decades, slowly nodded. As Elena went back inside to finish closing up, neither of them could have imagined that this simple act of kindness was the first thread in a tapestry that would weave their lives together in ways neither expected. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, and as Eleanor counted out her register and Richard waited in the rain, both were about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures. 25 minutes later, Eleanor emerged from the diner to find Richard Walsh collapsed on the wet pavement beside his car, his expensive overcoat offering little protection from the cold reality that his body was shutting down. This wasn't just feeling under the weather, this was something much more serious. And Eleanor was the only person in the world who was there to help him. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Sometimes we all need someone to notice when we're struggling, even when we're trying our hardest to seem okay. Elena's heart hammered as she knelt beside Richard on the wet asphalt, rain soaking through her uniform as she checked for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and when she gently shook his shoulder, his eyes fluttered open but seemed unfocused. "Richard, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'm calling an ambulance right now." "No," he whispered, trying to sit up and failing. "No hospitals, please." Eleanor had heard this before, usually from people who couldn't afford medical bills or who had complicated relationships with authority. But something in Richard's tone suggested a different kind of fear. Still, she couldn't let him lie in the rain. "I can't just leave you here," she said firmly, already pulling out her phone. "Whatever's going on, we need to get you help." As she dialed 911, Richard grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Wait," he gasped. "There's something I need to tell you, in case—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. People didn't talk like that unless they thought they might be dying. "Save your strength," she said gently. "Tell me later when you're feeling better." "No, you don't understand," Richard insisted, his grip tightening. "I don't have anyone, no family, no real friends. If something happens to me, everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it just disappears into legal battles and corporate buyouts. I've been alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have someone actually care." Eleanor felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She'd known loneliness herself, but she'd always had Maria, always had some thread connecting her to the world. The idea of being completely isolated, especially when facing what might be your final moments, was heartbreaking beyond words. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, which felt like hours. As the paramedics worked on Richard, checking his vitals and preparing to transport him, he kept his eyes fixed on Elena. Would you come with me?" he asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, but—" Elena didn't hesitate. She climbed into the ambulance, holding Richard's hand as they raced through the empty streets toward the hospital. She'd have to call her neighbor to check on Maria. She'd miss her morning shift at the diner's breakfast rush, and she had no idea how she'd get home. None of that mattered. Sometimes you meet someone at exactly the moment when they need you most, and walking away simply isn't an option. At the hospital, Eleanor learned that Richard Walsh wasn't just any businessman struggling with loneliness. He was the founder and CEO of Walsh Industries, one of the largest manufacturing companies on the East Coast. The nurses recognized his name immediately, and suddenly the atmosphere around his treatment changed. Private rooms were mentioned, specialists were called in, and hospital administrators appeared as if from nowhere. But through it all, Richard refused to let go of Eleanor's hand. When the doctors asked about next of kin, he looked directly at her. "She's all I have," he said simply, and Eleanor felt the weight of that trust settle around her like a blanket. The diagnosis was a massive heart attack, complicated by years of stress, poor eating habits, and the kind of isolation that literally breaks your heart. Richard needed surgery, and there was no guarantee he'd survive it. As they prepared to take him into the operating room, he squeezed Eleanor's hand one more time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing me, for staying. I can't remember the last time someone—" "Shh," Elena said softly. "You're going to be fine. And when you wake up, I'll be right here. Have you ever been the person someone turned to in their darkest moment? Or maybe you've been the one who needed someone to simply stay. Let us know in the comments. These stories of human connection matter more than we often realize." 6 hours later, Eleanor was still in the hospital waiting room, having called in sick to her morning shift and arranged for Maria's breakfast and school pickup. She'd never missed work for anything less than her daughter being seriously ill. But something told her that Richard needed her to be there when he woke up. If he woke up. The surgeon finally emerged at 10, still in his scrubs, looking tired but optimistic. "Are you family?" he asked Elena, and she started to explain that she was just someone who'd helped, but he cut her off. "Mr. Walsh was very specific that you're to be treated as his primary contact. The surgery went well, but it was touch and go there for a while. He's going to need significant recovery time and major lifestyle changes." Eleanor felt relief flood through her like warm water. Richard was alive. Everything else could be figured out later. When she was finally allowed to see him, Richard looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital bed and the network of monitors and IV lines. But his eyes were clear when they found hers, and his smile, though weak, was genuine. "You stayed," he said, and Eleanor heard wonder in his voice, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "I told you I would," she replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Richard admitted with a small laugh that quickly turned into a cough. "But alive, thanks to you." He paused, studying her face. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Elena nodded, waiting. "I meant what I said last night about not having anyone. My wife died 8 years ago. We never had children, and I've spent so many years focused on business that I let every friendship fade away. But lying in that operating room, thinking I might not make it, all I could think about was how you saw I needed help and didn't hesitate to give it." Richard's voice grew stronger as he spoke, more certain. "I want to change that. Not just the being alone part, but the whole way I've been living. And I'd like your help." "What kind of help?" Eleanor asked, though something in her chest was already responding to the hope in his voice. "I want to offer you a job," Richard said. "Not charity, not payment for last night, but a real position. I need someone I can trust to help me figure out how to use what I've built for something meaningful. Someone who understands what it's like to work hard for everything you have, who knows the value of taking care of people. I've made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but I've never made a real difference in anyone's life until last night, when your kindness literally saved mine." Eleanor felt her world shifting, the careful boundaries of her small, predictable life suddenly expanding in directions she'd never imagined. "Richard, that's incredibly generous, but I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about running a company or managing money." "You know about taking care of people," Richard interrupted gently. "You know about showing up when someone needs you, about making tough decisions when they matter. Everything else can be learned." He reached for her hand. "I'm not talking about making you a CEO overnight. I'm talking about building something together. Maybe a foundation or a program that helps people the way you helped me. I'm talking about having a real friend and maybe giving you and your daughter opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise." The room fell quiet, except for the steady beep of Richard's heart monitor. Eleanor thought about Maria, about the college applications they couldn't afford to submit, about the dreams her daughter had put aside because they weren't practical. She thought about her own hands, already showing signs of arthritis at 42 from years of waitressing, and how many more years she could realistically keep working double shifts. But mostly, she thought about the man in the hospital bed who'd been so alone that a stranger's kindness had seemed like a miracle to him, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly the kind of miracle that could change both their lives. "Okay," Eleanor said softly, "let's try it. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales." Sometimes the most beautiful changes in life come from the most unexpected places. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the bright, welcoming lobby of the Walsh Foundation, watching as another family received the keys to their new home. The foundation, which she now co-directed with Richard, focused on helping working families achieve stability through housing assistance, educational scholarships, and emergency financial support. It was work that filled her heart in ways she'd never imagined possible. Richard had recovered fully from his heart attack, though the experience had indeed changed everything about how he lived. He'd sold Walsh Industries to his senior management team, keeping enough money to live comfortably while dedicating the rest to their foundation work. More importantly, he'd learned to build the connections he'd neglected for so many years. He and Eleanor had become genuine friends, their bond forged in that rainy night when one person's crisis became another person's opportunity to care. Maria, now 18 and preparing for her freshman year at Stanford on a scholarship the foundation had helped secure, often helped with foundation events. She'd watched her mother transform from someone who barely got by to someone who was helping others thrive, and it had changed her own understanding of what was possible in life. "Remember when you were just trying to get through each day?" Richard asked Elena as they watched the family celebration happening in the lobby. "Now, look what you've built. What we've built. And honestly, I think we both needed saving that night. You needed someone to care enough to help, and I needed to remember that there was more to life than just surviving." The foundation had helped over 300 families in its first year, but the real miracle was simpler and more personal. Two people who had been alone in different ways had found friendship, purpose, and hope in each other. Richard was no longer the isolated businessman who'd nearly died alone in a diner parking lot. Eleanor was no longer the exhausted waitress counting pennies and limiting her dreams. As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor thought about that October night when she'd made the choice to follow a stranger outside into the rain. It had seemed like such a small decision at the time, but small decisions often carry the largest consequences. One moment of choosing kindness over indifference, connection over isolation, had rippled outward to change not just 2 lives, but hundreds of others. Richard placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything that had changed between them and because of them. "For seeing me when I needed to be seen, for staying when I needed someone to stay, for helping me understand that the best way to honor a second chance is to make sure other people get their first chances too." Elena smiled, feeling the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. "Thank you for trusting a stranger with your life and for showing me that kindness isn't just something we give, it's something that comes back to us in ways we never expect." Outside, the October evening was crisp and clear. Nothing like that rainy night a year ago when 2 lonely people had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. But the warmth they discovered in that moment of crisis had grown into something lasting and beautiful, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest decision to care about another human being. The foundation would continue its work. Maria would pursue her dreams, and Richard would never again face a crisis alone. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor had learned that heroes don't need capes or superpowers. Sometimes they just need to pay attention to the people around them and choose compassion when it would be easier to look away. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales.